Oh, yes, billion. I got it. 350 billion.
Yeah, 19. Yeah, sure. We can go and get the. Marketing program, and so knowing this is a little bit different.
Right.
You know,
Yeah, the plan doesn't quite come from you guys like CARES Act did, but I figure it's kind of the same. So.
But yeah, hopefully that one's being. Well, I don't know what the record.
Yeah. We know what the rules are.
Yeah.
Okay, we're good. That's what the law says. Law don't always match, so.
Go ahead and make the contest.
Check, check, 1, 2, 3, check, check, 1, 2, 3.
So Pete's saying that I'm loud.
pretty, I'd say, remarkable that it's been a little over a year since we've had the first case of COVID in Missouri. It's March of last year. And after several months of working with the various municipalities in St. Louis County and the Municipal League and others, we were able and very proud to launch our municipal relief program in September of 2020, which provided $47 million to the 88 municipalities that are located in St. Louis County. As I'm sure all of the municipal leaders and their staff and folks that are online know, last year as part of the CARES Act and the Coronavirus Relief Funds monies that were provided for the recovery of and from COVID-19, smaller municipalities of under $500,000 were left out. And St. Louis County, as someone who received direct funding from the federal government through the coronavirus relief funds, and recognizing that the municipalities are very important partners in providing services to the nearly 1 million constituents that we serve in St. Louis County, recognize the importance of providing funding for the municipalities. And so we're very, very happy to partner with the munis in providing that relief. Out of that $47 million that was allocated, about 46 and some change was actually expended and used. And so we certainly recognize that the munis were in need of and could certainly use that money. As part of our administration and disbursement of these federal funds, St. Louis County engaged third-party firm Deloitte to help with audit, compliance, and just overall administration of these funds. As I'm sure all of you all know, there are a lot of regulatory requirements as well as rules and laws that are applicable, and it's really important to adhere to because the CRF funds, and as we'll hear later, the ARPA funds are subject to audit and overview, and involvement by the OIG at the Treasury Department. So compliance is something that's very, very important. And so we were very, very pleased to bring on Deloitte to both assist with compliance and audit and program management, as well as help think about the future and strategies around that. And so as we are preparing for this next wave of federal funding that is coming in the form of the State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund as part of ARPA, we are delighted to have Deloitte to join us today to provide some basic information about ARPA, some important considerations that municipalities as non-entitlement units or jurisdictions that are under 50,000 individuals or 50,000 people will be participating in ARPA. Just providing some information about what ARPA is and the important distinctions between ARPA and CARES, and some thoughts and considerations for moving into the future. I think it's important to recognize and understand that a lot of folks have been talking about the $193 million that St. Louis County as a government is receiving individually. But in addition to that $193 million, the 87 municipalities that are located in St. Louis County that have a population of over 50,000 as of the 2019 census version of the census. There will be 87 municipalities that are considered non-entitlement units that would be participating or subject to receiving the state and local fiscal recovery fund dollars through the state. So we wanted to share some of this basic information. And so with that, I will turn it over to Deloitte. The way that we're going to try to do this, because we know that we've got a lot of people that are also tuned in online, is that we're going to give Deloitte a chance to give their presentation. There's some folks that are here in the audience, and so if there are questions, folks can ask those questions. I'll come back up and repeat them into the microphone so that people that are online can hear them, and then we'll get answers. So with that, Unless there are any questions, I will go ahead and turn it over. Thanks.
Thank you, Cora. I appreciate that. Thank y'all for coming today. Thanks for allowing us to speak with y'all. My name is Sean Kilgris. I'm Managing Director with Deloitte. I've been with Deloitte last 16 years, about 33 years total experience. Started off my sort of disaster work in the Hurricane Katrina area down in Louisiana, and I've been in Colorado, Puerto Rico, Oklahoma, Texas, and actually did the work for Joplin, Missouri, as it relates to a lot of their HUD work. So sort of been in the disaster space for a while. I've got a few esteemed colleagues here with me that are going to speak here in a moment. Christina Capella, she'll speak a little bit on compliance. Damon Romani will speak a little bit on strategy, and Jeff Welch. And so I'm looking forward to their comments here shortly. Some of the things we want to cover today is a little bit hit two main areas, sort of the strategy and execution of the plans, and then also compliance. Those are two big areas as it relates to both these programs. And so we will expand on those further. But I think the main thing that I like to get across, there's a whole lot of money going out the door. Whole lot of money. The United States has never seen this in the past. And St. Louis County is getting a large chunk of that, $385 million, 173 in the CARES Act, 193 in ARPA, and then FEMA. Obviously, there's more of a reimbursement program is obviously involved here as it relates to what you guys are doing. But once again, when there's a lot of money, it's a finite number of money. So when it comes to strategy and execution, I always look at it this way. You're going to have to find ways where you want to put the money to effectively help the constituents, and ultimately to where you're going to be compliant so the monies don't get clawed back. That's an important area, I think. Yes, sir.
Yeah, we're
And
talking.
it's not on the left side of the, so it's important for us.
Thank you. Cora, is there a way we
Yeah,
can
we'll talk to that.
get a little bigger maybe? So in the interim, I'll read a little bit to you. How about that? Is that okay? Yeah, so 385 million total, 173 million comes from the CARES Act, 193 million that is ARPA, and an estimated 19.2 million is in the FEMA area. So total of 385. And the key objectives really of all these funds, I think is really important to think about. Just what are you trying to do, right? You're trying to address the negative economic effects out there. You're trying to help with lost revenues from a state local perspective. You're trying to address the public health challenges out there. You're trying to pay for essential workers. And you're trying to invest in certain water, sewer, and broadband aspects to help the constituents. So, and that's pretty key, because I mean, I personally have a 15-year-old son, and that broadband's pretty key to education right now. And so I don't think a lot of people miss that. And the teachers are pretty tough on the kids, as it relates to making sure they're getting their work done, and they got to have access to that broadband. So once again, I think that's pretty key to keep a focus on that. But I think the one last message I'd like to leave, and I know I've talked about a few things, is sort of the key objectives and the money and the strategy and the compliance. But one thing I say, every county, every state, every municipality are dealing with the same issue. This is unprecedented. They're having to figure out a way to effectively help their constituents with a large amount of money and not enough people to do it. And so all across the nation, we're dealing with this. And Damon's going to get into that because he's helping a few folks. I know in California, he's helping some folks. In New York, it's a tough situation. And I have to applaud St. Louis County. You guys are doing a very good job right now. There's still a lot more to go, but we definitely have a good headway. So with that said and done, I'd like to kick this over to Damon. Thank y'all very much.
All right, so I'm going to talk about some of the fun stuff. I jest, right? But I do, just so you guys understand a little bit about me, I actually do read regulation and statute going to sleep at night. Like it's a problem, but I love it. So I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about the CARES Act. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the ARPA Act or ARP Act and the ways that they're different. So all of you have been the recipients of or been involved in the distribution of the CARES funds. So that primarily came manifested through the Coronavirus Relief Fund, which was allocated to states and counties to distribute as needed to help mitigate the effects of the disaster. The way to think about CARES and the way to think about CRF is as response funding. So this was money to keep things moving. It was money to keep the gears greased. It was money to mitigate the immediate effects. And that's reflected in the rules that were established by the Department of Treasury around it. So you see a lot of broad statements, not a lot of direct clarity on what those funds could do. You do see a lot of statements around how you're going to comply, how you're going to report out on those funding, on the funding uses. Those are pretty clear. But you see some forgiveness almost on the margins. Not a lot, but a little bit, more than we've ever seen before. But it's reflective of the times. ARPA is a recovery program. Should be thought of as a recovery program. It should be thought of in the construct of a disaster, should be thought of as FEMA public assistance category C through G. All right, this is long-term funding. This is going to be deliberate funding. It's going to be, ideally, it will be strategic in its application. With recovery funding come rules. It's going to have a lot more rules than you saw with Coronavirus Relief Fund. You see there's $350 billion for state, local, tribal, and territorial governments. It does have a much broader focus. It's less on immediate needs and more on getting things going again, like back to some semblance of what it looked like before, and mitigating some of the effects of other things going forward. We see that the deadline is significantly longer. So the recipients of these funds have until December 31st, 2024 to incur costs. All right, what that means is to have the cost, to agree to pay the cost. That's swiping your credit card at a suit store, which I probably need to do because I lost weight during the COVID isolation period. But it's not necessarily when you have to pay. So as long as the cost is incurred by December 31st, 2024, you have until December 31st, 2026 to actually finish paying for it. All right, now that's no. So by December 31st, 2024, you have to have incurred the cost, signed the contract, encumbered the burden on the payee. But you have until December 31st, 2026 to write the last check. And the reason for that is this gets into some of the infrastructure frameworks that exist in here. You can't do a major water project in 6 months, right? You cannot do a major broadband project in 3 months. So what Treasury is saying is we have given you unprecedented ability to do certain, and I do mean certain, infrastructure projects. We recognize that it may take longer to design these things, to compete the work, to get the material actually executed. And so rather than take all your funds in 2020, at the end of 2024, they're giving you 2 extra years to finish paying for it. Excuse me. This money is not completely allocated based on population. Other factors were included in the distribution of ARPA dollars, including relative income levels, joblessness, things of that nature. And finally, CARES money is flowing directly to a lot of people. All right, and this is why this is about to get very, very complicated. There are 5,876 recipients of CARES funds in this country. 5,876. In a normal crisis, like a disaster, a hurricane, you might have 100, and you might be across 4 grant streams. With COVID, you have, and it might be a few $1 billion a year. With COVID, you have over $5 trillion, over 350 grant streams, and almost 6,000 recipients. This is an extremely complicated grant environment. There's not going to be a lot of time as Treasury comes down and starts doing its reviews. They're not going to have a lot of time to argue when it comes to these recovery funds. They're going to make decisions and move on. And they have the authority to do it. In fact, what we've seen is the Pandemic Relief Accountability Committee, PRAC, as we affectionately refer to it, is a collection of OIGs that have gotten together to work together to oversee all these funds because there's just so much money on the street. Hurricane Maria completely destroyed the island of Puerto Rico. It was like an EF5 tornado across the entire island. It's about a $70 billion disaster. All right, it's just to give you kind of a frame of reference on how much money is out there. I guess I kind of already got ahead of myself on the slide. So complex funding requirements and changing rules. With CARES, you saw that a lot, right? The rules changed every week, seemed like. Constant new rules. Sometimes they would reverse a rule and expect everybody to just sort of figure it out. Now, in the OIG, the oversight guidance and everything that came subsequent to all of that, it's pretty clear they know that they did that, right? ARPA is much more deliberate. The interim final rule was 151 pages when printed page by page, not in the 3 columns of Federal Register format. It's got another 60 pages or so of frequently asked questions, annexes, and tables. Right? It should tell you a lot about where Treasury's head is on this. CRF funding was a page, followed by about 8 pages of FAQs, and that was how they promulgated guidance throughout the entire period. Again, response, recovery. It is worth reading the interim final rule. Yes, it's 151 pages. There's about 30 pages of rules in there and about 120 pages of intent. The intent is important because it helps you understand where the administration's head is, where Congress's head is, insofar as how this money is going to be expended. I already said the number of funding streams. I already talked about the amount of funding. The documentation requirements are going to get really interesting here. So for those of you that aren't aware, and I'm going like, this isn't even 101 level, I'm going like 99 level. You have 2 things you can do that will always get you in trouble with the federal government grants. You can have a duplication of benefits violation, or you can do something called an augmentation of appropriations. And I'll let our expert talk a little bit more about those, but the reason I'm bringing it up right now is a lot of these funds have overlapping eligibilities. What that means is if you are not paying very close attention to what's going on in your area, you have the risk of inadvertently creating a duplication of benefits violation. And when you do that, the federal government finds out about it, they don't decrement just the amount you duplicated, they decrement both pots. Right? So that not only is that $1,000 expenditure going to cost you now the $1,000 to pay for, but it's going to take $1,000 out of each of the pots that you allowed to cross. All right? It is no joke. We've seen it happen all the time with FEMA. Augmentation of appropriations is a little more complicated. You probably won't have that problem here. But what that basically means is you're spending funds on something that is within the purview or a budgeted allocation or line item of another entity, right? So you can't supplement someone else's appropriation to pay for something. There's going to be risk. No grant program is risk-free, like none. I mean, we've seen things that were cut and dry. Yep, no, that tornado definitely destroyed that building. And we still spend 4 years litigating with FEMA whether or not it really destroyed that building or how much of the building was destroyed. Does the foundation need to be redone? Right? There is no way of getting to zero risk. What our focus is to get you to the lowest amount of risk that you can tolerate. So when we're helping advise the county and advise anybody else we're told to advise, we're going to tell you, okay, yes, you can do what you just said you wanted to do, but there is some measure of risk, and here are the things you can do to mitigate a clawback from the federal government. Sometimes that is a redonkulous amount of I use that word, yes, it happened, of documentation. Like things that you're just like, really? I have to have this receipt? Yeah, you have to have that receipt. And the reason for that is because no one wants 4, 5, 6 years from now, when Treasury finally gets around to evaluating your spend, no one wants to not be able to justify the expense at that point. Because some of you may not be there. Some of the career officials that work in the different entities across this county may not be there. So you can't guarantee you're going to have that institutional knowledge. So building a robust packet along with clear documentation about what you were thinking, why you were thinking, what you were planning on doing is going to be essential. It is not in my interest to review receipts for 8 cents or what have you, right? It's just not. But it is in my interest to make sure you guys keep that 8 cents, which means I'm going to ask for a receipt for it. Hopefully that makes sense. And now I'm into Christina's slides, and she is a much more pleasant person to talk to. So I'm going to let her come up here and speak.
I thought you were plenty pleasant, but thank you for the introduction. My name is Christina Capello. I am a senior manager at Deloitte. I have been working with federal grant funding for the last 10 years. It started with FEMA grant funding alongside Sean with Hurricane Katrina in Louisiana. And while what we're dealing with now is not FEMA funding, it's great that that's where we started because the regulations for FEMA are so strict that we've kind of learned these policies over the years and what people have come to expect and exactly what documentation somebody can even possibly ask for that 8-cent receipt that Damon was talking about. And so our background has super helped us out when we all got to March 2020 last year and needed to start figuring out how to handle new streams of funding. So I am going to be talking a little bit today about the compliance part of it. Damon talks a lot about strategy, which bleeds into compliance. And I know that Damon talked a little bit about the 150-page interim final rule document. And 120 pages of that is intent. And he's right, I do highly recommend reading it. It was actually a much easier read than I expected it to be, which was great. Those other 30 pages of rules and eligibility and compliance are definitely important, but there's still a lot more to go. They have a lot more information to give us. And so for reporting, they actually like saying it like more to come soon. So what we are here to talk about today is just to help prepare folks based on things that we have seen in the past, based on reasons that compliance is super useful from the beginning and to think about it from the beginning so that when you get to 2024 and 2026 and the end of that audit timeframe, you're super confident. We want to help keep people super confident during that timeframe so that when somebody does come back and ask for something, you totally have that packet of information. And so some of the major risks of dealing with federal grant funding: clawback and deobligation of funds. So what's the difference between those two things? Deobligation of funding occurs if you have not yet received the money, and the clawback of funding occurs if you have received the funding for it already. So if you've gotten the money already and then they find out that it was spent how it wasn't supposed to be spent, then they would come take it back and you're actually responsible to return it. So you need to figure out where that money is going to come from in your budget. And that's something that you or your future administration doesn't want to have to deal with because you and we want to make sure that you can keep that money or have the highest possibility of keeping that money that you were given. Negative media coverage is another big one. And I mean, nobody wants to be featured on the news for something that went wrong or not as expected. Just thinking about reputational risk to a government entity, we just want to help think about compliance ahead of time to kind of stay away from the negative media coverage. Next up, fraud, waste, and abuse. This is a huge risk. We have seen it a little bit already through a lot of the PRAC reports that have come out and some of the schemes that we have seen. And so we want to try and put controls in place from the beginning in order to catch those things. Damon talked a little bit about duplication of benefits. So there's systems that you can put in place to check to see if you're giving money to the same person more than once, to see if you're giving money to people at the same address, to double check other qualifying information on an applicant. And putting those systems in place definitely helps to decrease fraud, waste, and abuse. A failed OIG audit is also a risk. And so OIG, Office of Inspector General, you'll see this on a few more slides coming up too. This is the audit that we talk about a little bit. This is what we're preparing for. This is why we're creating the packet of documentation so that when the OIG does come in, or may come in, not definitely, you have your packet of documentation that's ready to go at this point. And one of the risks of an OIG audit is that you could end up losing the funding that you were given. And we want to help try to make sure that that doesn't happen. And the last major risk is about misdirected funds. And officials need to ensure that the money is given to the programs in areas best suited to combat the pandemic's impact and serve St. Louis County residents. And so we want to help figure out through compliance and make sure that money gets to the proper place. Here's a little bit about the criticality of compliance initiatives. We can talk about criticality, we can talk about benefits. So one of the things of putting a compliance system in place is that you can help mitigate fraud, waste, and abuse. And starting with really great controls, that is something that you can do in order to catch things before they come up. You can identify high-risk applicants through the compliance process. when you are given funding and then pass it through to somebody else as a subrecipient, you're actually required to do subrecipient monitoring on them. And what that means is that you kind of meet with the subrecipient and make sure that they have the systems and policies in place in order to be able to manage the funding that you are giving them. And what that does is it helps give you confidence that the money that they are spending is being spent according to the eligible and compliance rules. And one of the components of subrecipient monitoring is actually doing a risk assessment, and you can identify people as low, medium, and high risk. And this kind of helps you figure out where to put your effort. You know, there's only so many hours in a day. This funding does have a finite timeline, and this can definitely help you in developing your processes and your monitoring to make sure that your time is going to the right location. Here it is again, preparing for an OIG audit. What you're going to want to do in order to do this is definitely what Damon was talking about on building that packet of documentation. You look at an expense and you take that packet of documentation and you review it for two separate things. You review it for completeness to make sure that every piece of documentation that you need is there. And then you review it for compliance to make sure that what that documentation says matches what is required by the eligibility requirements and the compliance requirements. And if you can get this packet of information together now, when somebody, Damon talked about somebody like not being there in a few years, I like to think that they won the lottery and that's why they're not there anymore. So when people win the lottery and then are no longer at their job a few years from now, the OIG is going to come back and still be asking these questions. And if you have that packet of documentation, then you're good to go and you can feel confident in the choices that you made. And then last up, mitigating the deobligation risk. And that packet of information that you're putting together definitely helps with that, but also just making sure that you are, when you are administrating the grant funds, when you are like managing them, the process, the tracking, how you're communicating with people, you can go ahead and build compliance initiatives into those grant administration activities as well, which can absolutely help you have a better opportunity to keep the funding that you are given. So these are a few things on the screen right now that talk about, they are some leading practices that we've seen in our time in helping to administer and manage grant programs. A bunch of these things come from the rules and regulations, and a bunch of these things come from just like practices and the way that we have seen things play out. And so I'll talk a little bit about both of those things as I go through the slide here. So the first two kind of go together for me. Navigating eligibility and compliance requirements, and then staying current on federal guidance. That 150-page document that Damon was talking about, print it out, highlight it up, put some tabs in it, keep it right next to your desk for every single time that you need it. Of the deck?
You can email it.
Cool. For those watching live, the question was if there's a hard copy, and it can be emailed out. So as I said, keep that packet of document, or keep the interim final rule nearby for ARPA. If you are handling the CARES Act funding still, print out your CARES Act Federal Register and keep it nearby. If you're dealing with FEMA requirements, take your copy of the Papa G and put it next to you. Papa G, Public Assistance Policies and Procedures Guide, in case anybody's looking for it. I always say, like, I'm not somebody with a great memory, you know, like I can't recite off all of the regulations to you, but I've read them enough times that I know that they're there and that I have to go look for them. And like, that's enough, which I'm, as a person with no real long-term memory, is excited to say. So like, keep your rules and regulations nearby, stay current on the guidance. Somebody from your municipality, their job can every day be to go to the Treasury website and look to see if there's new information. That's all it takes. It's like a quick, like 5-minute task, but it's really good to be able to stay on top of that information. Next up, following subrecipient monitoring requirements is a super useful cornerstone of a successful compliance program. I talked a little bit about subrecipient monitoring before, but essentially it involves running a risk assessment to figure out if you are giving money to somebody as a subrecipient, who the low, medium, and high risk folks might be, And then kind of just running tests to make sure that they have the compliance procedures in place to manage the funding. Something else that's also included in subrecipient monitoring requirements is doing single audit reviews. So any entity that receives over $750,000 of federal grant funding is required to have a single audit completed on an annual basis. And if you are doing subrecipient monitoring, you can request a copy of that single audit and go in and look at it and see if there were any findings, to know if there were any kind of compliance issues that folks might have had that needed to be corrected in order to best comply with the funding. And so setting up a subrecipient monitoring program from the beginning is super useful if it is necessary for your organization. Identifying signs of fraud, waste, and abuse. You can put proper controls and procedures in place to catch things before they become a problem. Managing a successful relationship with the applicant. This one, and communicate clearly and often, definitely goes together for me. And just sort of making sure to keep everybody in the loop who has to be in the loop on things, right? So it could be like just even within a department, within folks who are managing the money, if you have just a few people who are handling the money within your organization, keeping a running email on all of the information that as it comes out and questions and answers that you've received from somewhere, keeping all of the information on a shared drive, really just making sure that as new information is released, people are talking about it and how to implement it. So we know that new guidance is going to be coming out, and kind of just communicating that to the people for whom it will be important is something to keep top of mind as you are developing your programs. Some things that we've seen that have worked is like you have weekly meetings to talk about when new guidance comes out and what it means. You can also just like create an email blast update. Another one that we've seen through the years is to create a single source of truth within your federal grant documentation or within your federal grant tracking. So as you receive the funding, keep an Excel spreadsheet. It's like the most basic form of this that keeps all of the money that is coming in, how it has been spent, and like who is responsible for that information. If you can keep all of that information in one place, you're doing pretty good. We've seen through the years that if people are operating off of multiple spreadsheets that all contain a different kind of information or different numbers, that there could end up being a problem in the end when people are referencing different data points as they are talking. Next one, good document retention. We've talked about this a lot, but it's kind of the most important part, which is why we keep talking about it, is that packet of documentation that supports the expense. And that includes the invoices. As we move towards recovery, the procurement rules are probably going to become a little bit more stringent. And so keeping the procurement documentation nearby, keeping the policies that were in place at the time that the money was spent is also incredibly important, because you're going to need to compare those policies to the like procurement documents that you get at the end of the day. And then in addition to all of the like physical, tangible, quantitative stuff, you're also going to want to be making sure that you keep track of emails that kind of talk about how decisions were made and why decisions were made. Because as we said, in 4 years, when somebody has won the lottery and is no longer sitting at their desk, there's not going to be somebody to ask about why a decision was made, about why a certain type of cleanser was bought, or why the water and infrastructure program was run a certain way.
Or can it be subcommittees?
Sure. So absolutely. I'm going to try to summarize it, and then you can tell me how I did. Okay. The question, I believe, was whether or not it is required to have public participation when making decisions about the use of grant funding.
Some elected officials be a subset of that citizen participation.
Cool. Or can a subsect of elected officials be making those decisions instead? I haven't dealt with this too much yet. I feel like Damon might actually know how things come out in practice a little bit more. I would look at the policies and procedures that your individual municipality has in place to start about how decisions need to be made within the municipality usually. And then I know that there has been a lot of encouragement from the funding sources that have been released in order to get public participation. I don't know if there's any other information that we would want to add at this time.
Handled internally. How they do it. Once those rules.
Cool. And for the folks listening online, that was however it's usually handled internally at the county level, state level, municipality level. So long as those rules are followed, you should be good to go. Yeah. Whatever government level that you are operating within, those normal rules should be followed at that time. And that's why it's important to keep the policies with the documents so that you know what policies were in place when you made the decisions. Cool. So, cornerstones of a successful compliance program. Slide completed. And my last slide is just talking a little bit more about OIG audits. They've come up a lot. We're really just trying to make sure that folks who get funding have the highest opportunity to keep that funding, which means spending it according to those eligibility rules, spending it compliantly, and documenting it really, really well. And so if somebody does come from the OIG to come look at your documentation in years to come, things that they might be looking for are duplication of benefits, poor grant management and administration, monitoring issues, unsupported costs, ineligible worker cost, lack of internal controls, unreasonable costs, procurement or contract issues, deviations from grant requirements, and costs not in the scope of work. And some of these, like usually in FEMA public assistance land, procurement and contract issues is at the top of that list. It's what we usually see coming from OIG audits in my past experience. And so like you're going to want to make sure that you have the information about how you procured the services, especially in the recover phase of this funding. You want to make sure that you have that documented and you have all of the proper procurement like approvals from your internal department. What you're going to end up looking at is you're going to look at the local guidelines, the state guidelines, and the federal guidelines, and you're going to follow whichever one of those is the most strict. So you're going to look at like the ones you have, and then the state ones, and then 2 CFR 200 are the uniform grant guidance rules. And within there, it talks a lot about procurement done at the federal level. Any other ones here that I want to hit on? The unreasonable costs one, if OIG does come in to look at unreasonable costs, this is when they're going to go back and they're going to look at exactly like why you made the decision. Like if you can write a great memo that explains this is why the decision was made at this time, that is going to be your best opportunity in order to be able to make an argument against why you should be able to keep that funding. And then many other ones of these talk about not only about how the money is spent, but also about the grant administration. What are some of the potential ramifications of an OIG audit if it, doesn't go well? Well, deobligation or clawback of funds, which we talked about a little bit before. Deobligation is just when like the allocation gets removed. Clawback is when you've gotten the money already and then it needs to be taken back. So you need to find the other money in your budget in order to pay for it. Negative media coverage, we talked about a little bit before. It's just kind of like not where you want to be in life. Potential for disciplinary action is always an option. And then this last one, which like doesn't sound like much, but being identified as high risk by the federal government, which like in my brain is a little bit of like being on the naughty list, which then just means that people kind of expect not great things, which means they could possibly put harder procedures in place that you need to follow. And so it's just always good to stay off of that list. Next up, I believe, is going to be Jeff to talk about going forward and how to navigate the receipt of federal funds.
All right, thanks, Christina. I promise to keep this last slide brief. A little bit of background on myself. Jeff Welch, I've been with the firm for 13 years. I have a background in third-party risk management and standing up third-party risk management programs, including contract compliance, which has very naturally found relevancy within the COVID environment. So there's been a lot that has been covered today, a lot to unpack, a lot to consider, and the intention isn't to overwhelm or to necessarily scare anyone in any regard, but it's important to consider all the elements of what's at hand. There's a lot to consider, and ultimately the decisions lie with the county and county officials, but it's important to consider all of the ins and outs of what we're dealing with in the current situation. And while we are in very unprecedented times, the tenets of managing federal grants remains the same. And so what we've captured here are, okay, let's compartmentalize everything that we've talked about into these 4 primary steps. And what's interesting here too about the ARPA situation, again, not to belabor the point, but what Damon was highlighting earlier, stark differences in the sense that CARES was a response. You had to act on the fly. You didn't necessarily have the ability to structure programs in the way that maybe you would have liked. And everyone across the country dealt with the same type of situation. It was very challenging. There was not a single person that I'd imagine that sailed breezily through the whole CARES situation. But with ARPA, you do have the ability to lean on lessons learned from 2020, establish additional parameters and safeguards as you begin to plan forward and act accordingly. And so the inherent nature of why it was designed the way it was and why the additional runway you have with ARPA as opposed to CARES is to afford you the ability to be more, whether it's selective, more purposeful in how you use these funds in a more confined manner. And so these 4 stages that we've highlighted on the screen kind of outline the process from start to finish. So on the identify side, and this goes back to your question earlier around community involvement, at minimum, it's important to at least get a pulse on the community. So there's various ways to go about doing that. And there's not necessarily a wrong answer to that. But that is a very important part of the process to understand what does the community want, what does the community need, what is feasible. And so that identification process and solicitation of various programs that may be set up is a very important starting point that outlines your journey and how you want to move forward when it comes to ARPA. And also understanding the level of funding streams. You know, this isn't, you've got one funding stream, you operate from that and you move on. There's a lot of complexities, a lot of different funding streams that come through ARPA that need to be factored in. And ultimately, I think everyone wants to maximize the benefits. Some programs may fall under one work stream, funding stream, some programs under another, some may be applicable to both. So how can you strategize in a way that maximizes your benefits? So that's very important to the identification stage. But once you have that pulse and read on the community, the design element becomes equally important. And this is where I think you can lean very heavily on those lessons learned. Again, if you could do it all over again, what would you do differently in terms of structuring your programs? Would you add additional safeguards? Would you increase communication protocols? How would you engage with constituents in a more productive manner? And so you can lean on that when you're designing these programs in place to limit some of the challenges that you may face on the back end. And so it's devising that methodology, kind of marrying the funding streams available with what the community wants versus what's feasible, and moving forward accordingly. The third phase is the execution. So this is actual administration of the programs themselves. And it's important to not only understand the programs that need to be funded through the design phase, but how best to manage those with all of the inherent complexes that may come into play. And going on the compliance side, this is where having a good and solid understanding of what will be needed down the road to ensure future compliance is important as you can kind of carry that process out through the execution phase. So instead of coming back in at the 11th hour and trying to find all the supporting documentation, to the extent that you can marry that process up and the execution just makes things go much more smoothly. The last phase is monitoring. And so this is keeping tabs upon the activity, the documentation of the recipients and subrecipients to make sure that they're holding up their end of the bargain, so to speak, and establishing the appropriate, again, documentation parameters, communication protocols. How do you want to engage with them on an ongoing basis, whether it's a cadence-related type of a situation, whether it's checkpoints, but having tabs on what's actually going on with the recipients of these monies. So just to close up, there's a lot to consider when it comes to managing ARPA programs. And if you tackle your strategy and roadmap in a methodical and defined manner, it makes things much easier. And given the situation that we're in with ARPA, where you do have this long runway, it does afford you the ability to ensure your house is in order early rather than on the back end. Because we've been in this game for a very long time. And if you're having to come in at the back end and try to fix any gaps or issues, it just makes things much more challenging, not only for those that are managing it, but most importantly, the constituents. So with that, I'll pass over to Sean for some closing remarks.
Right, thanks, Jeff. Just give you a personal story. A disaster is a disaster. It's a disaster. I have a personal story. My home during Hurricane Harvey got flooded. I had 40 inches of water in my house. I walked in, it smelled like a crawfish farm. And I needed folks to help me from the federal government. I needed things like that. It's sort of personal to me, helping others. And that's why we got in this business at Deloitte and working with the county. It's real important that it's done right. And if I was just summarize anything, like I said, it's very personal to me to help these folks, because we even had a close friend of ours die from COVID. And it's so important to get to the constituents and help them. And once again, I'm gonna summarize it. Get a good strategy. Make sure it's solid. Make sure you have a good execution program. And make sure it's compliant. That's what you gotta do. And understanding, and I always like to say this, and my guys make fun of me because I say it all the time, is that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and they're building this plane as they fly it. And that's what's going on right now. And so if you have to ask questions, do I need to? Probably the answer is yes. So once again, I appreciate my colleagues. I get to work with these folks every day. The county's been great, and I'm so blessed to be able to work with you guys. And I don't know if we open for questions or.
Great. All right. So we'll go on ahead and get started with questions. I see we've got one from Pat Kelly, Executive Director of the St. Louis Municipal League. Thanks for being here, Pat.
Or at the municipal level, at least in our municipality, St. Louis, or not, have never run social or programs, I guess, that passing funds through to another end. If they're putting something out to bid and building, they have policies in place for that. They don't have any policies in place for, as a pass-through organization, distribute funds, health level, home improvement level, or anything. St. Louis, that's really. So to that end, I think that could be an issue for a lot of municipalities in St. Louis County. My question is, we have one community that already has said that they're considering an outreach program, loans to homeowners grants to homeowners for $1,000 to make homes. What I'm hearing under guidelines and the policies and procedures they have to put in place, they're going to have to do not only just write that check, but they're going to have to do follow-up to make sure that that homeowner spent that $1,000 on home improvement. Correct. And then documenting that those expenses were made well. They're going to have to collect those from the home, make sure that they document what they spent. I'm just saying, is that?
Yes. Pat, thank you so much for asking that question. It's a perfect question. And so I'll try to summarize it for the folks that are listening. And then I hope we can have a little bit of discussion about it. But Pat was essentially asking or pointing out that many of the municipalities or the non-entitlement units who will be receiving funding through ARPA from the state that's passed through from the federal government don't have experience with running programs. Typically, those are functions that are left to St. Louis County. And we, as I pointed out at the beginning of this, we partner very closely with our municipalities. And so Pat's question was just about some munis, for instance, who have floated the idea of homeowners programs and sending checks out to individual homeowners. And based on what we've heard from Deloitte today and just all the regulatory and compliance requirements around these funds, it's not enough to just send a check. You will also have to get documentation from those folks about how the funding that was sent was used, reporting, and so on and so forth. And the question really is about, I think, capacity of the non-entitlement units, the local municipalities, to not only set up programs, but administer the programs, manage the programs, make sure that compliance is going with those programs. I can say from St. Louis County's perspective, and having worked very closely with CARES funding and the CRF dollars over the past year, where we started a handful of programs in response to COVID and the fact that we've got 4,000 employees in St. Louis County government, that it was quite a massive undertaking even to launch those programs that we launched for the first time in St. Louis County with the CRF funds. And I would say, a lot more resources than many of the local municipalities. We've had folks, and it's, I'm very fortunate that I just get up here, just have the responsibility of getting up here and summarizing. We have folks, county employees, that worked very, very hard to do their regular jobs on top of doing all of the work and all of the administration, the management, the documentation, all of that had to happen to be compliant with the use of these funds. And that was the county, right? The county government. And so I think that that's a very, very, very important point to raise. And one of the very, I think, positive differences with the recovery funds that are the ARPA funds and the CRF dollars that were the response dollars is in that there's a lot more flexibility that exists with the ARPA funds and the ability for jurisdictions to use them for things like revenue and that sort of thing. And so, this, that was something that was not clear very early on with ARPA, and it changed, quite frankly, right up until like January of this year, when those final rules were finally published in the Federal Register. And so I think that is something that is really, really important. That's certainly something that we are very conscious of. The amount of work that would go into not only starting a program, but maintaining a program that might not be something that is a normal function of a municipality, that might normally be left to the county and or the state, even for that matter. And really, what is the best use of these funds that are coming in? Do you hire somebody that's going to be a program management officer for 2 years, the time that it would take for the requirements for these incurred costs? Or do you just do something that is a lot more simpler and a lot simpler, a lot more streamlined, that wouldn't necessarily require starting a brand new program when there's not a lot of experience that folks have in administering these funds? Damon, I don't know if you want to add anything or if anybody else does. Yeah.
So we're going to hit it from 2 different angles to answer your question. So from a strategy side, I would tell you that program that you referenced there sounds complicated. I would definitely design, you have time. So I would recommend whoever's doing that or thinking of doing that, they design the program, go through exactly what it would look like, how it would work, and what controls they'd put in place, and then route it through somebody who knows inside and out the rules. It doesn't have to be us, but it's got to be someone, because of the 10 different permutations of that program I just sat here and thought about, only one of them maybe worked. So that just scares me when you approach federal dollars in that fashion. Yeah. But the way to get after it always is, like, if you think you're doing something that you're pretty sure is okay, or you think your reading of the rules says it's okay, write it out. Find somebody who understands the stuff. Like, send it to Cora, who can have one of us look at it, like whatever. But just, you have time, do it right. And then she's going to answer the rest of it. But
I took notes while you were asking your question. So in FEMA public assistance land, which is my background, you use 2 CFR 200, which defines that if you are a pass-through entity, which literally means if you like get funding and pass it on to somebody else, then you are responsible for doing the subrecipient monitoring. You are responsible for reviewing the folks you are passing the funding through. When CRF came out, they kind of played with this definition of subrecipient a little bit, and they created subrecipients, and then they created beneficiaries. And beneficiaries didn't have quite as strict of requirements for monitoring as regular subrecipients. And they didn't provide much information around this, but it kind of gave some wiggle room to like see how you felt about it from a risk perspective, because maybe you didn't need to review the beneficiaries as strictly as you would review the subrecipients. We haven't seen any definition yet come out, as far as I know, for what subrecipients count as for passing money through. And so we don't know yet if they're going to come up with like beneficiary being a like slightly less regulatory robust relationship. And so I would stay on the lookout for that right now. But while you're designing, as Damon mentioned, you have the time, like do it as thoroughly as you can. And so some things that we have seen in the past is like, it's all in that program setup. And if you can really look at how you're requesting information from people and what information you need from them before they can get the money, that's really like your best opportunity, is to lay the groundwork before they have the money. Because once somebody has the money, it's harder to, like, the emails go slightly less noticed. And so like asking for certifications up front from people, if you can like put your faith in the fact that if you're asking them to certify that the money was spent in accordance with all of these guidelines, you know, you can feel a little bit more confident in that. You can have people fill out questionnaires when they are applying for funding. You can ask them right off the bat if they receive $750,000 in federal grant funding to know if they would even have a single audit that you might need to look at. I'm sure that some of these entities are much smaller, and so the 750 isn't actually a threshold, but just really like setting up those systems and structures in order to like get the right certifications, ask the right questions from the people you're giving money to at the beginning, and to ask them to submit the right documents, and then kind of have somebody look over those when you receive it. And it's not that it's more work than not doing it, definitely. But if you can set it up correctly from the beginning, that's kind of like the best you can do. And then just to talk a little bit about the risk assessment. And so if you do need to like monitor these people that you're giving funding to, you get to determine what that risk assessment process looks like. And so you're going to come out with high, medium, and low risk people. And you might decide that people under a certain dollar threshold are low risk to your municipality. And so maybe those don't get as strict of like a looking through. The important part is just to document that and to think through it as well as you can at the beginning, like Damon was saying. I'm sorry? And then, so just some of the reasons that you do think through these design procedures at the beginning and do the compliance things is because there's a time frame after closeout that people can still come back and review in the audit process. So Sean was saying it's 3 years from like the closeout date per the 2 CFR requirements so that somebody can kind of come back and look at that information that you do have.
One follow-up. I think most municipalities were hoping that the agency passes through to their in their own community. Specifically for capital improvement. Back a couple months and talking with the governor and talking with the county, that they were hoping that they could collaborate and really share in some of those projects that put off or didn't have typical infrastructure projects. And do you think that there'll be any more changes or more flexibility to use the funds for those types of things? Because that would certainly make it a lot simpler for our communities to use those funds and documentation and so forth, and really not becoming that pass-through agency.
Do you want to summarize it, or would you like me to try? Oh, okay. I'm going to, please let me know if this is the summary of the question. I believe that the question is that many municipalities were hoping to spend the funding at the municipal level and that they maybe wouldn't have to manage the requirements of passing through to somebody else. And so the question is whether, is it okay to use the funding in that way, in the municipal level way?
Yeah, but right now, on capital improvement, it's or broadband.
Yep.
Municipalities in St. Louis County don't manage, so and broadband is, this isn't live. So would there be other uses? Could there be allowed?
Okay, so to summarize that second half, it's about whether the guidance is going to, if we have any awareness of maybe the guidance changing in the future for the water, sewer, and broadband requirements, which are super specific in the infrastructure world, and might they expand beyond those 3 specific requirements? Because it sounds like in St. Louis County, there are specific reasons those projects might not be as wanted, yeah? Needed. I'm going to pass it to Damon now.
So let me answer that real fast, and then, but because it's actually a fairly simple answer. No. So the law, it's because it requires the law to change, right? So you've got to get the 535 folks in Washington, D.C. to get together, pass a bill changing the rules. The Treasury can't change the rule on their own. They've got to follow the statute. Do I believe that the law might get revisited later in the year? I do. I don't know when. I don't know what that looks like. I suspect that it would have a lot to do with just how the infrastructure bill and some of the other things are being litigated on the Hill or being handled. But there's a risk associated with that. Now, what you can do is you can combine funds. So you have the ability, if you wanted to undertake a project, you can get within the scope of the things you're allowed to do, you can combine funds. You can ask the county, you can give some of the funds to the county to administer a project for you. This is one of those times the money can be moved around a little bit in a way that allows people to pool their resources. The reason why the funds were distributed this way was not because the federal government did not say, okay, St. Louis County, we're going to build this program based on the needs of St. Louis County. They had to try to make it based on the needs of 50 states, 6 territories, and a handful of tribal nations. And so it's not a perfect fit. What I would also tell you is that there is the revenue replacement provisions, which relate to government services. So it's a really complicated math, how you calculate revenue loss. But if you can demonstrate revenue loss, then you can tie it to a government service such as a road, the amount up to the revenue loss. And that is just a really hard thing to do. You have to understand that it includes all income, not just isolated income. So you can't just say I suffered a revenue loss in sales tax, because parking fees are included as revenue. So if you got an uptick in parking fees and it canceled your loss in sales to your sales tax revenue, you didn't have any revenue loss. That's a very, very simple example. But I I do want to be as clear as I can. This is not Treasury's fault, right? I'm more than happy to blame a federal agency when I can. Congress passed the law the way they passed it. All Treasury can do is interpret it. And because of the way they wrote that provision, there was not a lot of room for interpretation. And I realize you are not the only county to be county officials to be frustrated by it.
And that's why the intent of the.
That's why the intent of the regulation is so important, yes.
The question then about, so we are encouraged to leverage like fund like. They already have some plans for it. So they already have some plans for infrastructure that our municipality may all be eligible for. Is this funding that we can match with that or leverage with that?
So generally, no.
So still
Oh, so the question is, can you use your ARPA dollars, federal funds, to match an infrastructure project the community may be undertaking? And the general answer is no.
And to audit this, some of these.
Yes, so broadly speaking, you're allowed to use what is defined as a reasonable sum for the administration and auditing of these grant dollars. Now, we as a firm have chosen to broadly define that around 10% but you can look at some grant programs might be 8, some go as high as 20, depending on the complexity of the program, right? So what we did is we said, okay, well, we know FEMA allows between the state and the local, or the recipient and the subrecipient allows up to 12, is that right? Allows up to 12, so let's come back a little bit from that. I think Treasury, the fact that Treasury so clearly stated that it was an allowable cost is, I mean, they know that people are going to need help. Yeah. And no one is sitting on 150 employees that may or may not have something to do for 3 years, waiting for a grant program to come along that then can implement that grant.
Is this going to be bricks and mortar? Or is it all building out? You know.
So I would look at it more as in the services angle than in the hardware angle. What I would do is, and I mean it when I say this, right? Lay out what you want to do. And then really, really, really closely compare that to what the regulation says. And if it is not absolutely cut and dry clear, then ask, like, let someone help you. Sir, you had a question, then you, and then you.
Yes. Here. Sewer, water, and water. Some of the most important that we're looking at. We're small. We don't have much debt at all. But what does that leave us? What does that leave us for a real small community? I mean, it's almost like our hands are tied. Funds are available, but we can't hardly use it for anything.
So the question was, water, sewer, broadband are expensive by nature. You don't have a whole lot of it in your purview. And so the question was, what else can we do? All right.
What else can the small community in the middle of everything do? Use the funds for?
My question to you would be, is the goal of your community to spend on infrastructure, or is the goal to spend on some, like, are there other things, other needs that might need to be addressed?
Both.
All right,
Both,
so.
Equally, infrastructure and services.
Okay, so broadly. I cannot stress enough that this is broad, right? I'm not sitting in your municipality. I don't know everything about it. Focus on services with the municipality. Ask the county to help you handle infrastructure. All right, you know your people better than anyone else. Like, let's be honest. You know them way better than I do. You know them the best. So the other thing I would do is say, okay, I've got $5 million worth of work that needs to be done. Federal government gave me $1 million. I'm going to build a program, design a program for that other 4, and I'm going to ask the county to help with that. And now I know I'm committing the county, and I don't necessarily want to, but my point is just, this is a little bit haphazard in how the funds were distributed. There are things that you can do out here with your municipal funds and your water. Anybody in your neighborhood have a lead pipe going to their house? You can replace that. And there's no like Treasury has just said, if it's a lead pipe and you want to replace it, that is in the public health approved. So there are things you can do, especially around older construction where you see lead pipes. There's some other things you can do around asbestos and a few other things, but lead pipe is a big one. I know of one county in this country, not probably the one you're thinking of, that is spending their entire allocation ripping out lead pipe. That's it. That's all they're doing with their money. And because it solved the political challenges they were dealing with over the funds and who was in charge of what and everything else, everybody was happy because no one likes lead water or lead pipes for their water. There is a lot you can do. I know it sounds like there's not, but there's a lot you can do, I promise. So you have a couple options. Probably the best option is to list out the things you want to do, pass them to the county, and presumably we can go through and help provide some clarity around it.
I've got some information.
The goal here is to make sure that every penny gets spent, right? No one wants to send anything back. So helping you guys find those ways to solve your community's needs is, people say this all the time, right? You see a contractor come in here. I actually truly love what I do, almost as much as I love being in the Army. Like that's the only thing I love more. And yes, I read a lot of regulation. Yes, I read a lot of statute, but these guys have been dealing with me for a year now. I get really excited about this stuff because I get to actually see what happens, right? So this is why I chose this as a line of work. This is why, if you ever really want to spend some time and talk about my history, why my career has taken the path it's taken and I've had the jobs I've had. So it's important to me, and I'm not going to just leave you out there as long as I'm, contracted by the county to provide advice. Yes, ma'am.
So, first of all, so St. Louis County, if it's a municipality, there's things we want. County is gonna help us.
Now, who are you?
I'm Nancy Hartman, I'm the mayor of Bellevue Bay.
Okay, so perfect. So yeah, we actually, I don't think we work with you all for the municipality program. Okay, so then we will be able to assist. I was actually giving you the money, but we'll be happy to provide that. So, questions you might have.
So what we need in our city, the road, we need to build our road and we need to. We've already said that we can't use the money on that. But what we can do, a lot of work, put together a plan that of our $33,000, that's what, 33,000.
$36,523.
Thank you, okay. So we can take 10% of that, hire somebody, read through what it is we want to do, but we really can't do what we want.
Yeah.
Except we can give the money to the county.
No, that's not.
That's kind of how it feels, and I know you didn't make, but we can't get our street rebuilt because we can't use any money on that because you can't rebuild a street that has an elected official living on it, but we only have one street. We can't use any CDBG money for rebuilding our street. Like,
So
it just gets crazier and crazier.
what?
That if it's a certain percent of your over county budget, then you are ineligible, or your municipality budget. I do not know what your like annual budget amount is, 75%?
75%.
Are there any munis that, I don't know, that's another restriction.
So
And this doesn't need to be about me, but the county, is the county going, or are you going out information to the munis as to how to communicate with you?
We will be doing that.
Municipally will be doing that.
We've been working here, but yeah, we have that.
All right, thank you.
But anything that we can, you know, we're happy to help just because, you know, we work closely with you all. At least we try to, you know, got some experience, as does Deloitte, with the municipal program. And not every muni, I'm sorry that I got confused, not every muni participated. There were two that ultimately decided the amount of money that they were going to get through the MRP wasn't, you know, worth the amount of headache that it would have caused. And so
That was wonderful. It was worth it.
well, good.
I
I'm
did
glad
a
to
lot
hear
of
that.
work
I'm glad
for
to
no
hear that.
pay,
Yeah.
but I got it done.
Yeah, so we're happy to, you know,
I-
the extent to which we can help provide technical, I'll be sure.
so
Thank you.
I'm like Damon and everyone, I like to.
So you're absolutely correct. You fall into a gap that exists in the regulatory frameworks and everybody knows it exists. I don't know how they're going to fix it yet, but I do know it's being discussed. I know that my old colleagues are having regular meetings about how to mitigate some of these problems. What do you do when you send $36,000 to someone? Right? Like what? It's almost like what, why? And why can't we come in and help them in a different way? So I don't know what's going to come of it. I do not know what's going to come after the August recess and what they're going to do in the fall session. I just don't. I know that DC is a challenging operational environment right now. It's why I like to spend most of my time on the road instead of there. But you're not alone. And working, at some point, they're going to have to do something. And like I say, as long as we're here, we keep the county appraised of anything the Hill's doing. I know the state is watching what's the Hill's doing. I mean, we'll do our best. When I go back and talk to my colleagues, I'll make sure I mention, hey, I went and saw St. Louis County last week. And turns out there are a lot of places that they're like, what am I going to do with this money? I have one street. And because a government official lives on it, now I can't use any federal dollars for it. I mean, I'll be a little more detailed than that, but because they should understand that, right? And I don't know, I realize that I am going to be in the minority here, but I do believe that 99% of the people on Capitol Hill are well-intentioned, especially the staffers. They just can't conceive of every scenario in the legislation they pass.
Go ahead.
Blue tie, then you, and then you.
Thank you. Couple things.
Oh,
While we're talking, is what can we use? So we get an idea, you know, nothing to a municipal that doesn't have.
sure.
So taking that out of the equation, what can we use, based on what you've read in this rate? Can we use it, the municipal and county, what we can't use it?
Yeah, so we know already that you can use it for infrastructure related to, like we said, water, sewer, broadband. You can use it for regular infrastructure insofar as you can pair it to a revenue loss. The rest of this funding is for services related, and to the extent that materials or structures are needed to facilitate that. So what I would tell you is, if it touches health equity, if it touches outcomes, health outcomes, if it touches access to medical care equity, you're probably going to be able to find a way to make it work. Now, I'm not going to say that 100% of the time it's going to work, but if that is your goal, then there is probably a path from that goal to the funding that can be constructed and a program that can be built around it. It is not going to do everything that y'all want it to do. I'm sorry, I wish I could stand up here and tell you it was just carte blanche. My job is to make sure that you guys understand the risks that are involved in using federal dollars and what, you know, is broadly permissible and what isn't. There's a lot of gray area, a lot of gray area. You would think with 151 pages of rules, we would have little gray area, but there's not. So that's why I say it's so important to read, to understand the intent of the document, because it will give you a better idea of how those funds might be used in that gray area.
Well, I mean, like, so, but it's not, talk about use these buzzwords, like, what does that mean to person sent? Buy a bus and go pick them up, take them to the doctor because of that, because municipals don't provide healthcare in even the county, total healthcare.
Councilman Carter, I think that's kind of what Pat's point was earlier. Sorry, I'm just, yeah, sorry, I forgot folks are online. I think that was kind of what Pat's point was earlier, just the idea of starting new programs, even if that is something that is permissible under the current rules and regs. And, you know, I think it's a little bit more definition. There's like 5 different categories or areas that these local fiscal recovery dollars can be used for. But just the sheer amount of work and effort that it would take to start a program, maintain compliance in a program, all of that for munis that don't have a lot of experience with programmatic, just really doing any sort of programs at all, much less or more programs related to health equity, it might be useful to look at other avenues and opportunities like revenue replacement, like infrastructure as it relates to sewer, broadband, or water. But I think it's you know, one thing that we do know that it can be used on, which is a very important change from CRF, is that revenue aspect. And that should be something that should be a lot, I think, more beneficial to the munis who last year were not able to do it. And then I'm sure a lot of y'all recall, there was that last minute change by the Treasury that said that certain payroll related expenses could be used, because that was something that until like the very last minute was unclear. And so, you know, I think what we would say, you know, and we've got this included in some of the information that we've given you with our report. I think it was 94% of all of the expenses that were submitted for reimbursement or that were checked rather by Deloitte for the municipal relief program was related to public safety payroll expenses. So we didn't really see a lot of instances with municipalities in which they were creating brand new programs or trying to do programs, as much as they were just trying to make sure that, you know, the lights stayed on and folks were able to get paid for the work that they were doing during the pandemic. So I wouldn't really anticipate, even with the 2-year sort of runway that we have with ARPA, that we'll see a lot of munis trying to start new programs from scratch. I would hope that that wouldn't happen, just because we know that that's a lot of work that goes into it. So we can use it for revenue replacement to the extent that they're related to certain services. And so that's something that I think is really important to focus on.
Can they use it with revenue funding? Because you can take a look at your budgets, decide what you spent, what you didn't spend, you need it, fill the difference. Now, would that be minus what you all?
So CARES doesn't count as revenue for this purpose. So, Councilman, what I would generally say is it's less about immediately what you can and can't do, because we could sit here and I could walk through the list of yeses and nos, but since 80% of it is in the gray, what we would typically say is, okay, what do you want to do? And we would start there. And then we'd say, okay, you want to do X. Great. And we start to lay out for you the different ways we can do X. Right? The different risks that you might have to take, things you don't want to do, and the different mechanisms that we can build around it to help protect those dollars once you get there. More often than not, and there are things that are just not going to be eligible, right? And they're going to be things you want to do that aren't eligible. But a lot of it we can figure out ways. And you also have to remember, there's 199 other funding streams associated with ARPA, right? It's not just, well, 195, sorry. It's 196 funding streams identified so far. So your state and local fiscal recovery dollars are just one. So just because you say, I want to do, you know, I want to paint every building purple, and I tell you that that's not eligible under the local fiscal recovery dollar, there might be a paint the building, paint the world purple grant stream. There's not, but just for an example. Grant stream and those other 195. And then it's incumbent on us, councilman, is to come to you and say, you can't use this pot of money, but you can use this pot to do what you want. And then here are the things you have to do to get access to that funding. Here's the administrative burden associated with it. And here's any reporting requirements that are associated with it. Because the state and local fiscal, there's only it's a $1.9 trillion bill. The funds we're mostly talking to you guys about right now are some segment of 350 billion. There is a lot of other money coming out there. And so part of what we do is we sit and say, okay, you have a thing you want to accomplish. My job then is to help you build a way to accomplish it. And it may not involve your local fiscal recovery. It may not involve ARPA fund. There may be if you paint the buildings purple, just for an example, there may be a tie to energy conservation. And we find a grant in Department of Energy or in agriculture even that applies to that and lets you get after that problem set, completely separate from COVID dollars. I'm sorry, sir, go ahead.
One ties into it. And municipal, could a small improve all their streets?
Yeah.
In that case?
So
Is that possible?
the grants that handle roads, right? There are a handful. They're mostly related to rural, but let's just hold constant that there are grants out there that deal with hard infrastructure, roads, bridges, stuff like that. Some of those are being like they require the county to be the applicant. Some of them, they require states to be the applicant, right? So understanding that and working through that is the first step to success here, right? On that particular deal. But there are creative ways to get after roads within the ARPA constructs. There's a lot of things I can do that will have the effect of improving a road. So it's just a function of telling us what you want to do and then letting us help you find a way to get after it. Because I'm never going to break the law. I have young children. I have children. I don't want to go to jail. I like my farm. And I'm never going to violate ethics. I left my last job because of that. So, but within those bounds, I will build you a program if I can. And if I can, I'm going to tell you, because I would rather you be mad at me because I couldn't accomplish something than lie to you. That's just who I am. But I am looking, and I don't mean to sound, I mean it when I say I love what I do, and I get very passionate about it, sir. Sir.
So in our community, took a pretty good hit. First, a couple of different questions. First, I've heard that you can't count CARES Act funding as your base from which you're measuring your lesser revenue.
That's right.
So I'll have to take that. But then I guess my question is, how do I document that? Do I, when the time comes to give the report, do I show month over month revenues? And then if I haven't lost as much as I thought I was going to lose, then either I have to give that money back, so to speak, because this is coming over 2 fiscal years, and I'm basing on our fiscal years are July 1. So money won't come until after July 1 because the governor is not making this request and holding up the money to when it comes and blah, 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 I'm not getting into all that. But how do I document that? And then if my revenue loss is not as much as I think, then do I have to give that money back or find some other eligible to spend it on as I'm going through my next 2 fiscal years?
So here's what I'll do to answer your question. First off, the short answer is there is an established formula that Treasury has created using exactly that formula to calculate it. I will have my team put together a short document that explains exactly how to do that math. We'll send it to Cora and we'll get it out to you guys.
Okay, that would help a lot.
No problem, sir. Happy to help. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I just was going to make. We're recommending to all the municipalities. But if when we get these funds, that you set up a separate take a deep breath. You don't have to spend them the first month. We have till December of 24 to do that. And by that time, maybe 3 or 4 months down the line, we can have some additional conversations, some other, the Treasury on how we can use funds. So, again, we're all happy we're going to have some time to do that. So,
And I'm going to cede the floor back to Cora, but one thing I just wanted to leave to your point. The Treasury has waived the prohibition on collecting interest related to these funds. So when it's sitting in your bank account, even if it's $30,000 or $100,000, whatever it is, you don't have to, like, as long as it's the normal bank account, you didn't go and put it in like an actual investment or a high yield account or something, you get to keep the interest on those funds, which is also relatively unprecedented. Well, it is unprecedented because the Cash Management Improvement Act. So.
So thank you so much, Damon, and really Jeff and Christina and Sean and everyone from Deloitte. Thank you for everyone who's been in attendance asking all these really great questions. We will continue these conversations. The county wants to be a resource for you all. This is, again, as I'm sure we've heard this adjective over and over again, but this is an unprecedented time. And so the extent to which we can use the lessons that we've learned over the past year in dealing with just COVID response as we prepare to move into the recovery phase. We are here and available to provide as much assistance as we possibly can. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and adjourn. So thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.